Hello, my name is Chris Barnes, and I'm the Scholarly Communications Librarian at Franklin and Marshall College. Thanks for attending my talk today, OER Advocacy, as part of a library-led textbook affordability initiative with student government. In this talk, I will be covering the origins of the F&M Textbook Affordability Initiative, and specifically its roots within DEI efforts on campus, the development of the faculty and student surveys, and specifically how they were intended to be complementary and yield actionable data. And then we'll look at the survey questions and results of both the 2019 Faculty Course Material Survey and the 2020 Student Textbook Spending Survey. And we'll finish up by talking about some preliminary conclusions and recommendations. Okay. So the F&M Textbook Affordability Initiative is a collaboration of the College Library and the Diplomatic Congress, which is the name for our student government. And it was started in response to an open letter that they sent to the Faculty Council in the spring of 2019. And that open letter pleads for help with the quote-unquote dire issue that the exorbitant cost of course materials has become for an increasing number of F&M students. It connects the issue to the college's participation in the American Talent Initiative and efforts in support of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The American Talent Initiative is an effort to bring high-achieving students from lower income backgrounds to campuses all across the country at elite institutions. And we were one of the initial leaders of the initiative. And so it was with that in mind that the students drafting the letter raised DEI and F&M's leadership in that area. And then lastly, the open letter argues that, quote, a student at F&M should never have to drop a class or have their ability to keep up with the pace of the class impeded upon by the financial barriers which textbooks can represent, close quote. And so the initiative was really based upon this open letter and their call for assistance. And in response to that, I drafted an action plan that had items for both faculty and students. And we circulated this plan, and people liked it, and DipCon especially was very interested in the idea of conducting a student survey, which would get us some hard data on what students were actually spending on course materials. So the members of the Diplomatic Congress, the president and vice president specifically of the Academic Life Committee, you see them on the right-hand side there, Yusra and Ruby, they joined me in meetings with the Committee on Instructional and Research Services, SEERS, and that's comprised of faculty as well as the head of IT and the head of the library and a couple of students. And that was really helpful for us because it allowed us to bounce ideas off of different stakeholders with different viewpoints. And it was from those conversations that the idea of a faculty survey arose. A faculty survey which would be launched in conjunction or in sort of tandem with a student survey, and they would ideally inform one another. So that was the plan from the start. And then so that was planned for the following academic year, and that initial spring of 2019, rather than run a survey, I worked with the student government representative to run a textbook broke wall. And that is an activity wherein students write down the most they've spent on textbooks and other materials in a given semester, and then they place it on a post-it on a wall. And by the end of the week or so, when you have the activity going, you have a very um, arresting visual representation of what the average student is spending on campus. It's anecdotal, but it does give one data point, if you will, for what students are actually spending on campus. Okay, so the surveys themselves, what we're going to look at discuss now is sort of the planning and development of them, their design. And so from the outset, we knew we wanted more than anything to have them render data that was actionable, information that would allow us to improve the situation on campus. And so while we did our best to, randomize and have the format of the survey be as close to a experimental format as possible. We were much more concerned about the kinds of questions we were asking and the ways in which we could use their answers to affect change on campus. And so we wanted the surveys to be complementary to the extent possible. So we wanted to ask questions that would be shed light on both sides of the issue. And so, for example, we wanted faculty members to guess how many students or what percentage of students generally go without one of the required books in their class, and compare that to what students said that they were actually doing. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. And so the questions themselves, some of them were borrowed from other surveys because we wanted to be able to compare some of the data. And for that, I'd strongly recommend checking out the OER research toolkit from the Open Education group. Okay, and so the faculty course material survey was first. It was in 2019, and the student version was in 2020. And so we'll talk about the faculty survey first. It was run from 20th November to the 14th of December of 2019, and it was actually administered by the Center for Opinion Research here at Franklin and Marshall. They were able to, administer it via email, and all 328 members of the F&M faculty and professional staff with teaching responsibilities were emailed an invitation with a survey link, and there were 141 total responses, giving an overall response rate of 43%, which we were very pleased with. But actually, the 328 individuals who received the email is much larger than the 279 or so full-time members of the faculty. And so we got a response from 132 of those 279 full-time members of the faculty. And so our response rate for that group was 47%. And we had at least 2 faculty members from each academic department who completed the survey, which made us feel more confident in the representativeness of its results. In terms of responses by department, biology was the department with the most number of respondents, followed by business, organizations, and society and chemistry. And then you can see there the other remaining 7 of the top 10. Now for the questions themselves. So the very first question we asked was about the factors faculty use when they are evaluating course materials. So when selecting a required course textbook, how important are each of the following factors to you? And so this gives a visual representation of the different levels of importance. So it goes from the left, extremely important, to very, moderately, slightly, and not at all important. And they are sorted by extremely important. So top left, clear and accessible writing, received the most votes as extremely important, and therefore it's at the top of the list, followed second by cost to the student, and third by ease of fit with current teaching materials. The next slide has an easier to read chart, so we'll move there. And here we have the actual totals for the extremely important and very important categories. You could see that clear and accessible writing is number 1 with a bullet. It got the most extremely important and the second most very important, behind comprehensiveness of coverage and ease of fit with current teaching materials. Cost to the student is number 2 when ranked or sorted rather by extremely important. However, in terms of total votes for extremely important and very important, it gets beat out by ease of fit with current teaching materials. And so those 3 are really, depending on how you want to weigh the results, those 3, clear and accessible writing, cost to student, and ease of fit with current teaching materials are the most important factors for our faculty when they are selecting course materials. And that is in line with what we were expecting. And it also reinforces the idea that, whenever we are talking about moving from traditional course material to OER, we have to take into account the way in which they would fit with current teaching materials, and in addition to cost to the student and clear and accessible writing. And so these various categories were taken from Rajiv Jangiani's and his wife's survey, which again you can find in the Open Education Group's OER Research Toolkit. Okay, let me move on to question 2. Do you require that students use publisher courseware, i.e. a website linked to a textbook requiring access code, to complete homework assignments and other coursework online? And this was a very excellent result, if you will, because it shows that 0% of the respondents use courseware for all of their courses, and only a small percentage of respondents, 13%, use it for some of their courses. Why is this such a good result? Well, it is known that one of the principal barriers preventing many faculty from switching from commercial textbooks and courseware to OER is the commercial courseware that is linked to the textbooks. It's not that they are particularly thrilled with the quality of that courseware, but it does a lot of things for them and their students that are not easily replicable by the learning management systems like Canvas or Moodle that we employ on campus. But the day is coming where you would have the same sorts of functionality in Canvas or Moodle that you would have in some of these publisher courseware websites. But the fact that so few of our faculty use publisher courseware on a regular basis means that it should be easier for us to get them to switch to OER, because it would not necessarily mean we'd have to find them a corresponding linked courseware option to accompany the OER. Okay, question 3. Do you try to keep the total cost of required course materials under a certain dollar amount for your courses? So 65% of respondents said that they did attempt to do that, and of those who said yes, 84% tried to keep the total amount under $100, or some figure that was less than $100, and 26% of respondents tried to keep the total amount under $50. So that gives us a fairly good sense of what our faculty consider to be affordable. However, if each course was $100 for its course materials, that would still be, with the average course load being 4 courses a semester, be a $400 bill for course materials, which we would still consider to be rather high. Okay, so moving on. Question 5. Do you currently require any textbooks that? Each one of these, the idea behind it was some sort of actionable data. So do you believe them to be overpriced or unaffordable? We wanted to know whether or not faculty would view them in this way, just as students would. And we got 42 or 30, close to 34% of respondents saying yes to that question. 26, close to 27% answered yes to that they assign books that they don't completely use, or assign less than half the book. And that, as we'll see, was a particularly sore point for many students who saw themselves being asked to purchase books that only a few chapters of which were used. 21% are assigning books that they're actively seeking to replace, and just under 20% are assigning books that are owned by the library in ebook format. For question 6, have you searched for or assigned an open educational resource? One of the best sort of conclusions from this to draw is that only 16 respondents couldn't answer the question because they were not familiar with OER. That in and of itself is a win. It's a relatively small number. However, the largest response was no, that they had not assigned or searched for an OER. And thankfully, I can sort these responses by department. And so that will give me a very good sense for who has looked for or assigned and who hasn't looked for an assigned OER. And that would enable me to target my outreach accordingly. Okay, moving right along. Do you teach any courses wherein the required materials usually cost nothing for students? Again, this is something we wanted to know so that we could then go back and think about ways of leveraging this kind of information, like marking in the course catalog those courses which have a zero cost course materials bill, as some other schools do. That's just one example. Another would be to see if perhaps there is a preponderance of these courses in a particular department or discipline, and there be avenues there for being able to say, for example, all of a given department's courses under a certain course level have zero cost course materials. So again, getting information that is actionable. Here are two questions that we asked which have a bearing on affordability, but are also have been impacted potentially by COVID-19. So do you typically allow the use of laptops or tablets in your classroom, so screens of any kind? And do you typically ask students to print a physical copy of the text to class? You can see that for question 8, screens are not allowed in 20% of respondents' classrooms, and the majority say yes, they are allowed, but only at certain times. So there are restrictions on screens in the classroom, even in those courses, those professors as well. And for bringing the physical copy of the text to class, the majority say no, 50% say no. Yes, 30%, and 21% only on certain days. So there's still a sizable percentage that want some sort of physical text in the room with the students they can refer to. So the question is, though, does the switch to the hybrid learning environment, switching to an online teaching environment, change the way faculty view screens in the classroom, or the idea of having a physical text in front of them in terms of how it impacts learning? I would wager that they are going to be more accepting of screens in the classroom and less likely to demand a physical copy of the text. But that would be, I would imagine as well, also very deep departmental or discipline specific, as it is now. Question 10, we wanted to know which affordability strategies they had employed. This was also a way of educating faculty, or at least those who were taking the survey, about the kinds of strategies that they could employ. So it was not surprising that the highest percentage upload required content to Canvas. That is probably going even higher now in again, the era of COVID-19 with the move to online teaching, and in our case, a hybrid environment. Much more likely to have facility with using Canvas and uploading content to it. Placing book orders by the start of registration. It's great to see that this was the second highest result here. And it's the excitement about that is tempered by the fact that this is a self-selecting group, and that if you chose to take this survey, there's a good chance that you also chose to realize or act on your realization that the earlier you get your book orders in, the better it is for your students, the more affordable options that will be available to them. And so it was great to be able to see what the various strategies are. That we would definitely like to find ways of improving, checking if the college library owns or can purchase online access. And so that is one of the conversations that has been begun as a result of that, of the responses to this survey, conversations within the library. If you had to guess, what percentage of students in a typical course that you teach do you think go without purchasing a required course textbook? So the most common answer was 10%, and that was about a quarter of all responses. But the second most common answer was 0%, meaning that they thought that none of their students went without purchasing a required textbook. Now, this is interesting because the student textbook survey actually indicates that 43% of all respondents went without one or two required books or access codes, and 14% went without three or more. So while it could be the case that these faculty members end up being the only ones who have students who are able to get all of the books for their courses, more than likely there is a fairly large disconnect between the perception of the faculty as regards the ability of their students to get all the required materials and the actual ability or willingness or affordability of those materials for their students to purchase. Okay, so that brings us to the student survey, or the student textbook spending survey, and that was launched in spring of 2020. It ran from the 30th of January to the 13th of March. All first and second year students were emailed directly multiple times. There were also flyers placed around campus, and representatives from DipCon were tabling in the Student Center on the week of the 3rd of February, as well as Open Education Week in March. We ended up getting a total of 406 responses, which was, we thought, quite good, with response rates for the individual classes of 31% for first years and 30% of second years. The response rate definitely would have been higher if not for COVID-19, which sort of hit our campus right towards the end of the survey and drove the response rate down. Okay, so we really wanted to keep the student survey short, and so we emphasized that it was only 4 questions when we did our promotion. Those 4 questions were: how much did you spend? Did you decide not to get some of the required books or access codes due to the cost? What measures have you taken to reduce the amount you spend? And has the cost of required books and access codes caused you to do any of the following? Options including dropping a course, performing poorly, various negative impacts on their academic or educational experience. And so in terms of the first question, how much did you spend? The vast majority of students spent under $300, somewhere between $100 and $300 on their course materials. There were students who spent quite a bit more than that, $400 to $600. There were still about 18 students in that range. And so this supports our understanding that many students are able to get in much lower than the national average. But unfortunately, they are doing this by virtue of not getting all of the required materials. And so in the next question, we actually we'll see that. First, though, we tried to evaluate or assess what the response for this question would be by division. And so unsurprisingly, our numbers come out to conclude that the natural sciences have the highest average of 248, the social sciences at 217, and the humanities at 201. In terms of class totals, we see that as you move along in your career, you are more likely to go without more books. So when you're in your first or second year, you go without 1 or 2 books, but 3 or more, you're only likely at 13% or 11%, whereas if you go to the juniors and seniors, you're looking at 26% who go without 3 or more, or 33% who go without 3 or more, bearing in mind that most of our responses came from first and second year students. What measures have you taken to reduce the amount you spend on your required materials? Renting when they would prefer to buy is the number one response, along with buying a used copy from a website. And then third, getting an ebook when they would prefer a print copy. And so while many students do rent and many students do choose E over print, often it is a result of the financial situation and not just general preference for format. Has the cost of required books and access codes caused you to do any of the following? So while the vast majority, 64%, said none of the above, several or significant or sizable numbers had to drop or withdraw from a course, had to not register for a certain course, or earn a poor grade or fail a course because they could not afford the materials. And lastly, there are even a few who had to decide on a different major as a result of the course material costs that they were confronting. So we've got a lot of really interesting results from the surveys, and here are some of our preliminary conclusions and recommendations. While the majority of our students are spending far less than the national average, many are doing so by going without one or more required books, and as a result, they are being negatively impacted by the high cost of course materials. So even though a sizable, though the majority are not being negatively impacted, a sizable percentage are, and those are the students we really need to target and focus on. We also have seen that faculty, while very cost conscious and implementing a lot of different cost saving strategies and working with their students to get the most affordable options, they're often unaware of how much their students are struggling in comparison to the reality of the situation. There's also on our campus lower than usual reliance upon publisher courseware, which is something that should be leveraged to ease with the transition to open educational resources. And we also have a lot of good departmental level data now as to awareness of and experimentation with open educational resources, which will facilitate our outreach and promotion of those resources to those departments. And so I thank you very much for your time. I see that I've gone a little bit over. I hope this has been both educational and enjoyable, and I would be more than happy to answer any questions you might have if you email me. My information is on the first slide, cbarnes@fnm.edu. Thanks very much, and have a great day.